Hi, everybody. And first of all, happy 4th of July. We've got a really fun show for you today. I'm with Arjun and Mike Bradley. We're going to talk a little bit about, of course, what's going on in the markets, what's happening in the first 6 months of the year, what are the big kind of outlook thoughts we have for you. But then we've got a dear friend joining us, Rob West. You know Rob from Thunder Said Energy. You also know him because we've had him on the show a couple of times. He's become a great friend. I've just had the distinct pleasure of visiting Rob in Estonia, so we'll probably tell you a couple of good stories or two. But Rob, let me just pause and wish you a happy 4th of July, and thank you so much for joining us today.
A happy 4th of July back at you all. Thank you. Fantastic.
Well, Mike, let's jump in. I was teasing you in the pregame. I'm in Germany, but you look a lot more Euro than me. But you've been outdressing me for as long as I know. So way to go, Bradley.
Yeah, Maynard, thank you. And happy 4th of July. And I hope you have a great time over there in Europe. Anyways, what we wanted to kind of discuss today is, what's it been like for the first half of this year, and just kind of give you some stats and really kind of start this thing off before we talk to Rob. And so I thought I'd give you a bunch of figures, and, we'll probably send something a little later on this. But for the first 6 months, U.S. government bonds, the 2-year bonds at 4.9%. That's up about 50 basis points this year. Motor gasoline prices, average regulars, $3.53 it ended. That's up around 33 cents so far this year. WTI closed at roughly $70.65. That's down about $10 for the first half of this year. Natural gas closed at $2.79. It was $4.47 at the beginning of the year, so down about 40% this year. European natural gas is around $12 an MMBTU, and that's down from $24, so roughly a 50% cut in European natural gas prices. Oil rig count, down 76 rigs for the first half of this year. That's down around 12%. Natural gas rig count, down about 32 rigs. That's down about 20%. And total rig count is down about 105 rigs year to date. So that's down about 15%. If we think about what's going on with OPEC right now, OPEC today, there's going to be a meeting on the 5th and 6th of this week. We expected that they would basically talk about their pledges for cuts. And Saudi came out today and said they're going to cut an addition. They're going to continue their cuts of 1 million barrels a day through August. Russia said they're going to continue to do a 500,000 barrel cut. Who knows if that's going to happen? But the point is, they've announced that they're going to go ahead and do these cuts. Crude is down on that news, so that kind of tells you where the market is right now. This year, S&P 500 is up roughly 16%. NASDAQ is up almost 40%. And put the NASDAQ in context, for a 6-month period. The last time we had a 6-month period this good was in the second half of 1999, and everyone remembers that was the whole Y2K hysteria when everyone was going to have to spend it was up 69%. So this is the second best performance since then. Energy is down 7% this year. E&Ps are down about 5%. Oil service down 5%. Oil majors, U.S. oil majors down 9%. Refiners down 5%. Alternative energy down 7%. But midstream is actually up 6%. So it was the clear winner year to date so far. A couple things we found interesting is that if you look at right now, the S&P 500 has 5 companies over $1 trillion in market cap. And that would be basically Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Nvidia. And the 2 of the biggest ones, that would be Apple and Microsoft. The combined market caps of those 2 is $5.5 trillion. To put that into context, that is bigger than the whole market caps of utilities and energy sectors combined. And if you look at that too, if you were to basically say that was a country's GDP, that combined market cap of those companies is bigger than the market caps of every company in the world, every country in the world except for the US and China. So, obviously it's been a really, really good year. Energy's been, an underperformer this year, and it's because of, a couple themes. Obviously oil prices are down, but I think from an energy standpoint, the 2 themes that we've been concentrated on this year and it's going to be a big theme in the second half of this year, is just inventory reserves for E&Ps. That's been a big focus of investors. And obviously oil price, oil service deflation is another big trend that's going to be going in the second half. So obviously people are going to be thinking that, they're going to be thinking that service spending next year is going to be lower, which is probably going to be lower. That doesn't mean activity is going to be lower. Service cost deflation is going to be lower. And so, I think that's what, people are going to want to concentrate on. And so it's been a rough first half, but we think the second half is going to be a little bit better. So we'll go ahead and hand it back to you, Maynard.
Oh, that's a great setup, Mike. Arjun, let me turn to you and see what's on your mind before we jump in with Rob.
Maynard, I too would like to wish America a happy birthday and all of our American viewers a happy July 4th. And I thought I might try and combine my family's story of independence with the energy transition and our theme that the energy transition itself needs to transition, which I think will be a good segue to our guest, Rob West, who I'm very excited to have on the show today. So I wrote about this in Superspike, and I won't repeat the story, but my parents came to America with $25 in 2 suitcases, and they and our family have completely lived the American dream. Within 1 generation, my father's a retired dean of Harvard. I had a great career at Goldman Sachs and now at Veritain, and I have a sister and a brother, and we have 7 children amongst us, and we are such beneficiaries of all this country has to offer. My parents, I had to fact check this. They were actually born in colonial India. It was still a British colony when they were born. Colonies seem like that's something should have happened like 1,000 years ago. My parents are 83. India, I guess, is 76. And so to go from being in a colony to then living this incredible American life, it's completely unfathomable. And sometimes you just have to remind yourself how lucky you are, how lucky I am, how lucky my children are to be American. That was not guaranteed. My parents actually went back to India for a year after graduate school and said, you know what? Not for us. We like what America has to offer. My dad got a job at Bell Labs, and then I was born. I'm the anchor baby here, and we stayed here, and they lived their lives here. And it's a miracle, Maynard. It's an absolute miracle. And what has that got to do with energy transition? So why do you want to rid yourself of being a colonial country? It is for freedom. It is for opportunity. You may not like the laws or the regulations being imposed upon you. You may not like the idea that your country's resources are being extracted for another land. There are lots of reasons why America wanted to become independent over 200 years ago, India 76 years ago. Look at energy transition discussion today. It is dominated by European and to some degree American as well, maybe left of center America, the right of center has got its own issues, narratives on how this should go. You should not do coal. You should not do natural gas. You must go into solar and wind and these other things. Like our perspective, my perspective is, how do you switch this discussion to one that puts the rest of the world first in terms of what their interests are? And I'll do it by way of example. How is it okay, Maynard, that Africa uses 4 million barrels a day and they've got 1.4 billion people? So they're 4% of global oil demand and they're 15, 20% of the population. Yet we're telling them, our regulatory bodies, our oversight bodies, you don't get to have a pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania, or you don't get to have natural gas infrastructure because we have a perspective on how to resolve what is perhaps too much CO2 going into the atmosphere. And I think the point I'd like to make is, in the same way we sought freedom and independence and our own right of economic determination, these countries all deserve that as well, which is not to say there shouldn't be a transition. If you're China and you import 12 million barrels a day of oil, an EV strategy makes sense. But China is also a dominant coal producer. What are the odds that China, post-max industrialization, post-peak population, is actually going to stop using coal? So the whole point of all this, Maynard, is on this Independence Day in America, how do these countries get energy independence? It is key to clean air, clean water, biodiversity. If you are richer, you will do better on the environmental metrics. There is a goal to decarbonize. It does go with economic freedom. Who wants to be dependent on OPEC countries or Russian producer, what have you? So there is a need for alternate and newer technologies. But the starting point to me should not be, this is what the IEA says. This is what the UN says, run by, I believe, a Spaniard, if I'm not mistaken. The IEA run by a very European perspective. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, run by Mark Carney, a perspective that here's what's allowed and not allowed. How is that freedom for these countries? And so basic point is this energy transition needs to transition, and it needs to put the rest of the world, give it the opportunity to have its own economic determination, to have its own energy determination. And I think with that, Maynard, and I'll try and end on a more positive note here, I think I'm very excited to have this discussion with Rob West, who I think has done some outstanding modeling. As someone who spent a career in research, I take a lot of pride in seeing independent research providers like Rob build this incredible business. I don't know how he does the modeling that he does. We need more people like Rob as part of the discussion. I think with that, Maynard, I'll turn it over to you, and I'm very excited for the conversation today.
Well, that's a fantastic lead-in, guys. It's hard to top it. Rob, we should probably just jump in, but I think with that lead-in, getting to talk to you from Estonia, a country that recently got its independence back in terms of the big picture, only 30 years. And you're right there in the center of Europe, so you hear all those discussions. I think, the question I was thinking, Arjun, when you said all that is, where is freedom? Where is freedom in all of this? Because it's very government-driven, very bureaucracy-driven, and we got a lot to talk about here, Rob. Why don't we just start and say, happy 4th. What's on your mind? What's the big picture with Rob West right now?
Right now, in this exact moment, it's just kind of being in awe and bowled over at what Arjun just said. I mean, a lot of that resonates with me. I'm an American in exile. I'm a Brit in exile, living in a country that got its freedom after 50 years of being illegally occupied by sort of naughty neighbor. And, when Estonia was out of the Soviet Union, got its independence back, its GDP per capita was 8 times lower than Finland across the border. And, it's taken the last 30 plus years to catch up, build, a very digital economy, something with the same GDP per capita as Spain, have that autonomy. And that's why a lot of what you said resonates with me. And one of the things that I find interesting being here and, helping be a part of that journey of a country that looks at what the US did, a couple of centuries ago and thinks that, that's what it means to be a country in the 21st century. And, to Arjun's point, like you can go back 35, 40 years and find 30-year plans being drawn up by Gorbachev for, what the nation of Estonia should look like in the 2020s. And I think, to Arjun's point, it is no less ridiculous to think that like the modern digital free nation of Estonia is going to be abiding by the rules laid down by Mr. Gorbachev 35 years ago, as that emerging economies of the world will be doing things in 2050 as laid down by policymakers today. The world will evolve and move on. And I guess the thing I'm really excited to get into today is how and what does that mean for for us as investors, decision makers, energy people, and I guess we should dive into that.
One question, Rob. You're as you mentioned, you're American, you're British, you're living in Estonia. You hear from people globally. I think one question we had, and we've had a number of European conversations this week, are attitudes changing in Europe? I mean, what do you feel happening in Europe as it relates to the quote transition? Where's the mindset? Are you seeing change? And I know it's a huge place with a lot of opinions, but what's the sentiment now?
Oh yeah, I think the world is as flighty as ever. There are some topics that just flare up and capture everybody's attention because they're topical at the moment. And then others that are really important sort of fall off the face of the earth. And I would put in that bucket, the theme of long-term energy shortage. I think it's one of the biggest, most important questions in the world. And, guess what? We've been through a period where we've had inflation, we've raised interest rates, faster than any time since the oil shocks. And we've caused a macro slowdown and a mini banking crisis in several places. And guess what? That's caused energy prices to be soft. But if you're worried about $1 trillion of cumulative underinvestment since 2016, that this world of 2023 kind of makes that harder to solve, not easier. And so I think I'm still quite worried that the world will be half a Europe short of energy in 2027, right at the time when transition-linked metals and materials need to grow in volume by 3x to 30x as part of the transition, and depending on the material or metal or commodity in question. And I think, in a way, to your question about what's happening in Europe right now, I'm worried that some of the temporarily soft macro conditions have distracted from this big picture important thing that is staring down the barrel in front of us.
Could you comment, Rob? Because we talked about it a little bit. Excuse me. You're there in Estonia. Last weekend, we almost had a Russian mutiny or revolution or something. Finland has joined NATO. Like, the attitudes in that part of the world around what's going on, it's just, you're much closer to it and you have much more history with it. I think our viewers would find that really interesting. Well,
the number one thing I have to say is that it just remains a wonderful place to live. I mean, it's such a interesting country. It's 50% forest. It's 1,500 islands. I have this closet theory that all Estonians are secretly geniuses, because otherwise they would never learn to speak what is undoubtedly one of the most complex and infuriating languages in the world. But I think, and just kind of going back to Arjun's point, which I can't sort of get out from swirling in my head. I mean, the really interesting one, thinking about the Prigozhin news the other weekend, I don't want to get myself thrown out of a window here, but you look at that story of what's happened in Estonia, and I sort of told it, and the story of what's happened in the US, and Arjun's story. And I think the thing that it's just I can't stop thinking about is, imagine you're the people of Kaliningrad or the people of Sakhalin or Yamal Nenets. History shows you, why do you want to be shackled to a corpse in Moscow? And, the way things are going, you can't help but wonder whether some of those regions that have ethnically distinct people, have had that ethnic distinction suppressed since the times of Stalin, are going to say, no, well, hold on, look at what these other countries have done. We should get a shot at this too. And God, that would be a thing for energy markets if that unfolded at some point. And it did come up over here when the Prigozhin, what do you call it, rampage, mutiny, I don't know. We heard that they were stepping up the military presence on the borders, because there was a worry that full civil war was going to break out in Russia, and there was going to be a stream of refugees wanting to come to Europe to escape the fighting. That lasted about a day, but stability is a fragile thing that can come off of a country like the skin of an old peach. And I think there are a lot of questions that naturally swirl around that and how it's going to go.
Maybe just to shift gears a little bit, I could ask you to comment on a couple of pieces you've written lately.
That's good, because it's less likely to get me thrown out of a window. So I like that.
Yeah, we gotta change the topic, Rob. It's getting too controversial. The first one was the need for energy surplus for a lot of reasons, but one of them is, if we're going to decarbonize and do a lot of the things we would like to do, we need to do it from a position of strength. And then the flip side of that is what you've already alluded to, is if we're in an energy shortage situation, we're not only going to not do a lot of the things we want to do, we may be taking some risks we shouldn't be taking. The second piece you recently came out with, and Mike alluded to it, is AI. And is AI the boogeyman? Is AI the knight on a white horse? Like, talk to us a little bit about that macro framework. And you love technology so much, we got to get you to talk about AI.
Well, I think I'll start with the second one, and it will partly answer the first one. Today, the internet uses about 800 terawatt hours of useful energy. So it's 1% of all global energy, and about just under 3% of all global electricity. And that has doubled in the last decade. But the main kind of amazing thing about that doubling is that it's a function of a Jaws effect. So actually, the volume of internet traffic data doesn't double once a decade. It doubles once every 2 years. And at the same time, the energy intensity of internet data, internet volumes, halve every 3 years. And so the net effect is, you double once a decade in total energy use. And AI is going to continue that trend, the continuation of Moore's law to its logical conclusion, and probably double global internet energy again by 2030. So, another 800 terawatt hours, another 3% upside on all global electricity. But, being a kind of energy nerd, increasingly my view is that for every terawatt hour of energy used by AI, about 10x more will be saved. 80 to 90% of all energy used today in the world is basically wasted. For some metals and materials value chains, for about a quarter of them, like the thermodynamic efficiency is below 5%. Like if you look at the standard enthalpy of formation of materials we're producing, we will use more than 20x more energy than the thermodynamic minimum of what you need to produce those things. And those are the sorts of problems that I actually think are going to end up being solvable by AI. And so I'm starting to de-risk things like 50% efficient solar cells and overcoming grid bottlenecks. And I mean, DAC and CCS are a great example. Today, the best DAC and CCS processes use about 20x more energy to 40x more energy than their thermodynamic minimum. And you've got a million possible metal organic frameworks out there, and some really clever computer theoretically figures out you want that one. And you could build a DAC plant which got to 60% total thermal efficiency. And so what are those things, and which ones can we de-risk and which ones can't we de-risk? In my view, you can't really de-risk lithium-ion batteries ever displacing hydrocarbons because of thermodynamics. You can't ever really de-risk hydrogen having that kind of step change because of thermodynamics. And this is all my long way of saying that, just mundanely, companies that get this right are going to move down their respective cost curves. They're going to get more efficient, more profitable, lower carbon. And I don't want it to sound too much like sort of digital hippie. I sort of wonder if actually like the continuation of Moore's law is going to save the world.
If you had to pick one thing that AI will help us with, and let's say in the next 5 years, what would be the thing that would be top of your list for some real impact?
Metals. I think metals would be the one. There are companies that I'm sure have crossed all of our radars that have next generation electrowinning technologies or leaching technologies. And, you think about a metal like copper, where really in thermodynamic terms, like our best processes today for extracting copper from some ores, 1% thermodynamically efficient. And, like we always get this in lithium, where it's like, could there be a magic box where you flow the brine in and like the lithium carbonate just drops out? And I mean, in conceptual state space, like that magic box exists. It's just nobody's been smart enough to find it. And so I think metals is where I would go. And I think, some of those metals technologies get really interesting for energy transition investors. And this is all my long-winded way of saying I haven't done the AI to oil note yet, but I will. So stay tuned.
Well, you know where to bring it when you do it, right?
There's some cool stuff in like refining membranes. Could you get a membrane where you flew crude oil in and without having to like fractionate stuff at 100 to 600 degrees, which takes quite a lot of energy, you just like perfectly separated all the molecules into their different grades. Anyway, I'm boring you now.
On AI, if it was just efficiency, it seems like efficiency has a huge amount of value that could be captured by AI.
It's really one of the biggest debates I see at the moment. So there is an IEA roadmap to net zero that says that the world's going to go from 8 billion people to 9.5. The emerging world is going to go from using 75% less energy than we do to 60-ish% less energy than we do. And yet global energy demand is going to go down 20% by 2050. And you sort of do the maths on it, like the energy intensity of GDP has fallen by 1% a year, quite steadily globally since 1970. And that roadmap requires something like a 3.5% to 4% reduction in the energy intensity of GDP, from tomorrow to 2050. The most we've ever done historically globally was in the 2% during the oil shocks, which tells you about the sorts of energy price conditions needed to drive that level of energy efficiency. I have a step up to the mid 2s in my energy transition roadmap. I can't really see how you get a step up to the mid 3s, but that's the big debate. Like I've got an energy transition roadmap where the world is using 50% more energy by 2050 than it is today. The IEA has one where we're using 20% less energy. And really, remarkably, it's just that difference in the compounding of what will happen to the energy intensity of GDP. So that's why that question just really matters.
Rob, I think you must be using AI right now because the amount of research that you put out every day is just phenomenal. So for viewers that don't know your product, maybe you might want to talk about the infrastructure behind your product and people, whatever the case may be. First of all,
I don't know. I'm just a nerdy guy who likes building models and reading patents and lives in a country where historically a lot of the friendly people died in the cold. So I'd sit at my desk and dig into questions that I get from my clients. And one of my favorite days every week is I like kind of locking myself in a room with a stack of patents about some technology and just figuring out what is this thing and how does it work? And can I de-risk it? Like, is it the next Theranos or is it the next NVIDIA? And I'm not sure you can entirely tell that from the patents, but sometimes you can get a steer. And I don't think maybe that's the best answer I can give you. I don't have, but the more I learn, the stupider I feel. I feel particularly stupid right now. I feel like energy transition kind of at the moment reminds me of that W.B. Yeats poem about the second coming, where he has a line in there where he says something like, the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And yeah, I mean, I think I sort of feel shocked by some of the things I hear people say about energy transition, said very, very forcefully. Recently, I've been doing a lot of questions where like stuff that I thought 2 or 3 years ago was a slam dunk. I'm like, but does that actually work in practice? Maybe post-combustion CCS has some things like that. Maybe green hydrogen has some things like that. I'm just sort of trying to conquer one internal stupidity at a time.
Yeah, we kind of talked about, sort of 6-month performance, year-to-date performance, what's gone on. I'm thinking about a lot of the research you've done year-to-date. I mean, what's kind of resonated with your clients, sort of themes that have resonated with clients, and where do you think you're going to be going maybe in the second half? Maybe not to give a an update on what you're going to put out there, but it just seems to me that a lot has happened in the last 6 months. In just what's resonated with your clients?
One thing I've seen that's really been exciting me is blue value chains. So, the United States has so many amazing things going for it. It's got, this is going to get me in trouble, but it's basically, compared to Europe, got infinite gas at the bottom of the cost, low on the cost curve, and a will to do it right and do it cleanly, and make products from that gas that can be sent to our more energy beleaguered friends in Europe. At a time when we're struggling with our industrial value chains, and increasingly we'd rather import stuff from countries that are leaders of the free world and not planning on invading their neighbors. And so what are these blue value chains that I'm talking about? Well, it's stuff like taking natural gas and reforming it and turning that methane molecule, CH4, into hydrogen and a pure stream of CO2 that can go in the ground, but not to kind of create new markets for fuels, but just to serve existing markets. So making 180 million tons a year of ammonia, we can make that in the US at maybe $500 a ton for a 10% IRR using blue hydrogen with 70% less carbon than regular ammonia. And the IRA comes along and it turns that 10% IRR into a 20% IRR. And then high energy prices in Europe come along, and $20 an MCF long term in Europe, it turns your 20% IRR into a 50% IRR. And there's no technology risk there, really. There's a debate about which reforming technology you use from which technology provider, which we could talk about. But this is real. Maynard and I were talking about this yesterday. Isn't it amazing when you can deploy capital in something that's ready? There isn't technology risk. You don't have to create a new market. Just have to go and build something and execute. Exactly. And that exists. And blue ammonia is one. I won't bore everybody with the details, but actually there are steel making pathways that are very similar. 6% of all the world's steel is not made using coking coal, but using a technology called direct reduction of iron ore, using syngas, reforming the methane molecule and using H2 as the reducing agent to pull out the oxygen from iron oxide. And, again, fully technically ready, fully ready to go. This is a technology where the world leaders today are Iran and Venezuela. If Iran and Venezuela can do it, well, guess what? We can probably do it in the US, and again, make 20% plus IRRs, incorporating where prices are in the rest of the world and the IRA. And so that's been the biggest boom where I've sort of been finding people getting excited this year.
Rob, what I really want to talk about with you is really your perspectives on modeling. And you've modeled energy transition, you've modeled net zero scenarios. And one of the things I really appreciate about your approach versus so many others is there's a pragmatism and a realism and a humility, all three things that I often find is really lacking in this energy transition, and especially the net zero discussion. It's not that others aren't doing good faith efforts, but they often start with the world has to be net zero by some year, usually 2050. And I'm not saying it's all back solved, because I think some people are doing very serious modeling, but it starts with that perspective first, as opposed to, and what I would propose is you start with the energy needs of all 8 billion people, soon to be 10 billion people on Earth, and then solve for the realities of their situation. And so I always wonder in the net zero models, not you, but others, are they just saying 1 to 3 or 5 billion people don't get to have improved living standards? Yeah. Or is it a pretend, yes, they're going to improve? Maybe not every country has the demographics and the geography that America does, but there is something in between having nothing and having an American economy that seems we should be aspiring to. Energy is treated as a necessary evil when in fact it's a huge enabler for economic growth. So I'd love to dive more into how you think about solving the world's energy needs, but then hopefully doing it with less carbon intensity and all the improved environmental metrics. And I'll just give an example. Yeah. If China is currently post-peak population and post-peak industrialization, I don't understand why they're going to be using less coal until they get to the point where the population declines, if it does go that way, start kicking in and they simply don't need it. I don't, and most net zero scenarios assume coal goes away. So we could probably talk for hours on modeling, but I just use it as an example of sort of the mindset of how to think about this, where so many others are trying to solve for the zero without, I think, taking into account basic human energy needs, as well as the realities of individual countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think about it as an exercise of minimizing overall ridiculousness. So, like in my energy transition model, let's just like go into an example. We need to be producing not 10 million electric vehicles per year, but something like 200 million electric vehicles a year by 2050. And in order to do that, well, kind of all else equal, I don't think people talk about sodium. I think EV batteries are going to remain lithium based. It's physics. And so lithium has to go from like 70,000 tons a year, like 2 million tons a year, which is like a ramp up of 30x, which is like faster than any commodity has ever ramped up on a 30-year basis. And you could say, oh yeah, so Rob, I'm going to take the under there. I don't think lithium is going to ramp up anywhere near that fast. If I go commodity by commodity, I think I have 40 different like commodities, value chains, all kind of linking up together. And basically they all grow somewhere between 3x and 30x, depending on what they are. And you could say like, oh, so I don't believe your lithium numbers. It's like, cool, okay. So if we bludgeon down my lithium numbers, we don't get that many electric vehicles, we want to get to net zero, then I'm just going to have to take something else that is slightly ridiculous, like that I think we can, ramp carbon capture and storage from 40 million tons a year to 7 billion tons a year, or like nature-based reforestation, like we can just co-opt 3 billion acres of planet Earth and, go and plant trees on it at 5 tons of CO2 per acre per year. And it's like, okay, so like they're all the numbers are ridiculous, right? And I think in a way, so all models are wrong, but the point, I guess, is to be usefully wrong. Is to find the ridiculousnesses that people are going to want to bet against and bet on. And I think at the moment, like in a one, to your point, Arjun, I think if there was one ridiculousness that I would bet against, having built all these models and joined them all up, it's the idea that energy demand is going to fall globally, on a 20, 30-year basis. I think it's going to rise 50%. And if you're telling me that we're in a market, one of us is a buyer, one of us is a seller, and you'd like to value assets on the assumption that global energy demand is going to fall 20% over the next 30 years, great. We're going to end up with very, very different valuations. And, neither of our models are going to be right. But like when we sort of compare them, like you at least want to have a model rather than like, picture of a donkey playing a banjo, like, and that's kind of how I think about it. I don't know if any of that kind of resonates with you.
No, I love that. And I love the sort of energy demand is likely to grow for as long as we can foresee. And I just wonder, this won't get me thrown out of the window because I'm in America, but it'll probably get me uninvited to various elite institutions, which is net zero the right objective? Again, we need new technologies. I'm in favor of decarbonizing if that is possible. But the obsession with net zero, I'm going to challenge whether this is, or I'm going to raise the question of whether this is actually an objective we should be striving for.
I think there are lots of really important objectives on planet Earth, to make conditions the best possible for like 8 to 10 billion people on the planet. And where I share your curiosity is whether there's a danger in putting one metric right at the top of the pile and saying this is the most important, if it means unacceptable compromises on other metrics. So, Maynard and I went up the old Soviet TV tower in Estonia yesterday, and we saw an oil shale facility. So like Estonia derives a meaningful portion of its grid from oil shale. And there was it's about as dirty as coal. And there was a big push in the EU over the last 10 years, like, no, phase it out and import Russian gas instead. And people in Estonia, who historically lived through like 3 to 4% of their population getting deported to Siberia, said, oh, actually, we'd rather not become dependent upon Russian gas, right? And I just put that as an example of, I would like to see the world get to net zero in my lifetime in a way that improves the like energy prosperity of 8 to 10 billion people on planet Earth. Like that kind of motivates why I find this space a fantastic one to be in, endlessly interesting. But if unabated CO2 emissions is like the worst evil you can imagine, then like world events over the last 12 months should be combed over and looked at as well.
Listening to you guys, all this conversation, it gets back to you have to have a healthy economy globally and by country, and whatever your region is, you have to have a strong economy to fund all this stuff. If you're going to fund AI research, you got to have a healthy economy. If you're going to clean up your environment, you got to have a healthy economy. And it seems like, to your point, Arjun, where we've gotten lost here, whether it's the developing world or the developed world, is focusing on growing the economy, growing wealth, because if you do that, you can't afford to do a lot of things. And one of the things we're doing right now is we've lost that focus, and it's going to hurt our pocketbooks. And that could threaten all of these spending programs, whether it's military, climate, you pick it. But I mean, Rob, do you think is that a way to think about this? Which it just kind of struck me listening to you.
Yeah, I'll tell you what excites me like so much about that is not just the Venn diagram of technologies that are economical and work and don't need to create vast new markets, but can tap into existing ones. And it's adding another sphere into the Venn diagram, which is technologies that make things better for people, that make things work better. And, there are some of those things in energy efficiency. And I think, those things are going to be the world changers, where if you can filter out the noise and get behind those, then, if you're selective in deploying capital, which I know you are, I know, most of my clients are, that's the stuff that we want to be finding. And, there are things in that bucket. So like, I've really gotten excited about EVs and solar over the last 12 months in the right applications. I think one thing that kind of increasingly dawns on me is the amazingness of semiconductors. Mike asked that question about, what will you be researching over the next 6 months? The amazingness of semiconductors kind of rise to the top of my head. How crazy is it that for the last 300 years, basically all human energy has been something burning or something turning. And now there is this stuff called semiconductor where you dope it in the right way and incoming photons create electricity. And it's not subject to, the thermodynamic limitations of heat engines and, challenges of Tmax in your Brayton cycle. Like, it's something that improves at an exponential rate due to Moore's law. And as it improves, those semiconductor technologies allow us to do things like create a rotating electromagnetic field into which you can slot a permanent magnet, into which you can create a vehicle that moves with, literally 85%, wagon to wheel efficiency, compared to just physics. Like a heat engine is going to lose 70, 80% of its efficiency because it's ejecting exhaust gases at 450 degrees centigrade that can never be recuperated. And that is a fundamental change. And I believe that for small scale mobility and for some forms of electricity generation, that you can fight that, but it's like fighting, it's like fighting for VHS in the 1990s. It's just like, guys, these wheels are already in motion. And there are limits to that principle. I don't ever think, so like, can I keep going? Am I boring? There is a strand on this, which is like, so like if you look at lithium ion battery today, maybe our energy density is about 200 watt hours per kilogram. And, hydrocarbon fuels are 12,000 watt hours per kilogram. And that 600x difference turns out to be really important if like your fully laden 737, on its way from where in Germany are you, Maynard?
I'm in Frankfurt now.
So Frankfurt back to Houston, a third of your takeoff weight is fuel, right? And so like density really matters in that debate. If you stretch a lithium ion battery to its absolute limit, like you get rid of the anode entirely, you manage to double the voltage of the cell without like degrading all the components by, electrolyzing them. You manage to quadruple the density of the cathode through like some metal magic. You get rid of like half of the separator and the electrolyte. You can maybe like in fantasy land, get a lithium ion battery to about 1200 watt hours per kilogram. So 10% the energy density of hydrocarbons. And to like Arjun's question about like, Rob, why are you such a models nerd? Like I'm telling you, like play with that model. You really can't get a lithium ion battery above 1200 watt hours per kilogram. Like, you can play with my model. Tell me what anode material you're putting in with negative mass, and like, we'll see. But I think that that point is really interesting. So, my oil market numbers, I think light transportation, is going to go electric, and I think heavy transportation is going to remain hydrocarbon. And that has so many implications for like our refining system. I mean, if you lose almost all of the gasoline demand, but you double global jet fuel demand and 30% up on global plastics, 100% up on global plastics demand, 40% up on maybe diesel and marine fuels, basically every refinery in the developed world has to get rebuilt, right? And so, this stuff just, it ramifies and gets interesting. And that's why I like being a models nerd.
I was thinking, Rob, you mentioned this idea of eliminating ridiculousness. Well, I love that. So one of them, this has come up particularly last week. It comes up a lot in power, which is, I would say, the philosophy of don't go dependent on the new thing until the new thing really works. Don't start turning off old stuff until we really have reliable new stuff. And that's very basic. We can't tell that that's really catching on because we're going so fast. And there is this, sometimes this crisis type thinking, or it's just uncoordinated, somewhere between the two. What about that one? Because it seems like globally, particularly in the developed world, we're really messing with power systems, and it's not smart, and we're taking risks. Is that your perspective? How do you feel about power systems and grids?
It's like watching a train crash in slow motion. I mean, back to my little Yeats quote. I mean, people who I think are really smart in this space. We're all looking at the same data. Power outages in the US have doubled over the last decade. The time taken to interconnect a new wind or solar project has gone from about 1 year, 15 years ago. It now takes 3 years, from application to getting a permit to connect. Statistically, a utility scale solar facility is going to have something like 100 power drops per day. And, that leans on having a grid with inertia and reactive power compensation. And the batteries, I think, that are going in are for just short-term smoothing, not for like, let's store it up on the sunny days and reuse it on the non-sunny days. My numbers, like, to get to net zero, we need to quadruple the total number of circuit kilometers in the entire global grid. Those are like very scary numbers. There's something like 7 million kilometers of transmission lines, 120 million kilometers of distribution lines. And look, if we don't build it, that will be the hard bottleneck on meeting like wind and solar ambitions as part of the energy transition. And I think that creates a lot of opportunity in, well, power electronics, capital goods, utilities who get paid on a rate of return basis, all the way through to power to metals like aluminium and copper, where just the build out of the grid that is required is something like roughly 10% upside on total demand for both of those commodities. The stat that I'll give you one more. Do you know when the utilization of the US grid peaked? Like, if you take all the power generating capacity in the US, it peaked in 1998 at 50%. In other words, in 1998, like, for every gigawatt installed on the grid, it was running 50% of the time. Today, we're just below 40, and by 2050, we're going to be something like 25%. So, basically per unit of delivered energy, the grid has to get twice as big. And then you're going to electrify more. So the grid has got even bigger. And, so this is where these staggering numbers come from. And I said it's like a slow motion train wreck because we're just so far behind. And I turn it to you guys, like, what do you think it takes for people to accelerate that and see, how much acceleration is needed?
Doesn't it take someone in leadership has to listen to those numbers and say, they have to listen to those numbers and say, we can't afford that. We have to
we need a sort of Winston Churchill of like power electronics. Yeah.
Okay. That's a great thought there.
Yeah, Rob, it's, one of the things I hear often is this whole energy trilemma, right? Everyone talks about affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And it seems to me like sustainability has been the primary objective, and the other two have been left behind. And so I think my question for you is, I look at it and say, I think inflation is going to be higher than expected for a lot longer than people think, simply because this energy transition is not going to be cheap, and it's an embedded inflation. How do you think about that? And if that's the case, is it just world GDP is just going to be slower over the next decade because of all the spending that's probably foolish?
I think that the hardest thing is the way energy ripples through supply chains, because, all materials are just some combination of something that came out of the ground, or energy, or labor, or all three. And the supply chains just get so complex. So I think the numbers that I have is that for the average material, something like 40% of the total end cost is energy. When you go through every single step of the supply chain and add it up. And if you think we're going to go into a world that is 2,000 to 5,000 terawatt hours short of energy, 2025 to 2030, well, there's only one way to cure that undersupply, and it's to have energy prices go to a level where somebody is not going to consume. And it might be Mrs. Miggins in her flat in Hammersmith. It might be the ammonia industry in Europe. It might be the bottom billion people in the world who, use over 90% less energy per capita than we do. Arjun's point from earlier, who kind of get priced out of the world. And, you made that point a moment ago, which is But, none of those are good options for, goals that we all have in either the energy trilemma or like goals for the world, goals that people feel good about on July the 4th. And so I think curing the energy shortage, like, it would be better to have too much energy and selectively not produce some of it than to have not enough and selectively not consume some of it.
Too much energy would definitely be a good issue for the world to move to. I know we've only got a few minutes left here, Rob, and I apologize that this becomes a cliche question, but it is the nuclear as sort of part of the solution here, which I don't think we've talked about yet. So I get why people want to electrify everything. It typically is more efficient than other ways of doing things, but without sizable baseload. And if people don't want coal, and if they ultimately don't want natural gas, how can it be that nuclear is not a major part of the solution? Not the 100% solution, but some meaningful portion of meeting all of our goals?
I think it is. When I lock myself in my room and do my little patent reviews, two things are inevitably true. When I read patents about green hydrogen electrofuels, I just decide to cut out the middleman and just hit my head against the wall. And when I read patents about next gen SMRs or even some of the ideas kind of being explored in fusion, I end up just thinking, wow, this is clear, this is well researched, these are good patent libraries. And so I think we will get nuclear as part of the solution. But what that means is that we double by 2050. So I think today it's something like 2,800 terawatt hours a year comes from nuclear. I have it getting to like 6,000. And, you talked earlier about models need to minimize the ridiculousness. Like, if you look back over the last 25 years, we've built 6 gigawatts of new nuclear every year, and we've closed 5. And so the kind of total nuclear generation has gone sideways. And in my charts, I have sideways, 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 boom, doubling. And, I sort of question it either way. I think it would be great for the transition if we had more. It would make it so much easier to decarbonize some of the materials value chains that we need to decarbonize. But I also don't want to de-risk too much too quickly and have people shout at me on that dimension either. So the really interesting one, I guess, will be, kind of coming full loop. Confining a plasma is a really good challenge for an AI, and we'll see.
So, Rob, it is hard to part with you because we have so much fun.
I know, back at you.
It's so much fun. As we were thinking about this show and knowing that it would go out on the 4th, we thought about, freedom and independence and a lot of different angles that you might talk about with energy in the 4th. Next year, guys, we'll do a NASCAR show and talk about, how it's powered. But in all seriousness, you wrote a paper not too long ago about how World War II, if you look at the energy policy and capability and access of each major participant, it really determined the war. And it's pretty fascinating, and you go through it, but we don't have time to do it justice. But would you mind just giving our audience a few minutes of that, because it's quite a history lesson about you better have power and you better have energy for a lot of reasons. First and foremost is your own security.
Yeah, I love it as a case study. There are some great quotes in there, like General Patton berating Eisenhower and saying, my men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas. But I think
that's like General Bradley to me, General Mike Bradley.
I think basically, I think my view is that in a energy analyst's way, the Second World War was decided by oil. It was from the very start to when the Polish cavalry is riding in against, the German tanks, to the very end when the Allies bombed the synfuel production facilities at Luna, which was basically where the Luftwaffe got all of its gasoline from coal to liquids. And it was on that day that Hitler's war minister said, like the war was decided. That was it. We were done. And, Hitler was sitting there in his bunker, confining like imaginary units to go and fly places where they couldn't go because they had no fuel. There have been pictures at the end of the war of German tanks being pulled by oxen, because of the acuteness of the fuel shortage. Maybe we should put a link to the article, in the footnotes of the podcast somewhere, because it's a nice free study and it's got some great facts.
Well, let's do it. And, there was a story there. You talk about the Germans had increased their fuel production, their synthetic fuel, to a pretty high level. But then the Allies, when they took out those facilities, that's when the Germans were done.
Yeah, there's a sort of weird bit in the 1930s when IG Farben starts building these synfuel facilities at Luna. And I think it was 1936, Hitler basically said, we need as much as possible, regardless of cost. It needs to be made in Germany. And I have read that a lot of military intelligence at the time, that was one of the reasons people were really thinking, wow, he's preparing for war, was, that ramping up of a totally economically crazy synfuels industry. Yeah.
Well, Rob, we probably do have to wrap up. It's hard. It's so great to spend time with you. We love what you're doing. We want to do more things with you. You are our first 3-time COBT friend.
That's an honor. Thank you.
And we're ready to book number 4 right now. We love it. So happy 4th to you and to all our viewers, Arjun, to you, to Mike, to our team, and to all our friends. We hope everybody has a great 4th, and just thank you for your friendship, Rob. It's so fun.
Back at you. Yeah, 100% back at you.
All righty. Thanks, everybody, and happy 4th.